this week, the biblical response to abortion. But before we go, I want to do this because Jason Maxey asked this last week. He said, how come we looked up the word live and not the word life? And we were looking at it. And so I wanted to give you the dictionary definition of life per Webster's 1828. And you'll see it is pretty much the same thing. It's more of a state of being. So here's what he wrote on the definition of life. In a general sense, that state of animals and plants or of an organized being in which its natural functions and motions are performed, or in which its organs are capable of performing their functions. So that was his definition of life. Live kind of took that and, what do we do with our life? It kind of took and made it more like Linda said last week, a verb, right? And so that's what we kind of looked at last week. But I wanted you to be able to see I wasn't trying to hide the word life by not doing life and doing live. It pretty much is the same statement. So a couple questions about abortion before we go any further. Is there a verse that speaks directly to the topic? That's obviously the best case scenario, right? Can we murder? And you ask the question, is there a verse that speaks to that? Well, it says, thou shalt not, if you're reading King James, thou shalt not murder. Kill is actually, it does say kill in some versions. But kill it can be changed because what if you step on a bug?
That's killing it.
Did you kill it? Is that prohibited? For all you bug and anti-spider people, you're like, I don't care. I'll take the punishment. Right? What they do to animals a lot, for sacrifices, for food. Can you kill a plant?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. If you're a gardener like me, yes, so 100%.
Or a farmer.
Or a farmer, maybe it happens. But so murder kind of speaks more to the killing of an innocent person. That's kind of the reason murder's out there instead of kill. I personally think it's a better translation to put murder than it is to put kill. It's just it kind of keeps it in the right lane. So when we have a verse like that, thou shalt not murder, or don't steal, don't commit adultery. These are kind of black and white ones. You can be like, well, is it okay to do this or not to do this? Here's the verse. It's not okay. But the question is there a verse that is as explicit as thou shalt not murder or thou shalt not kill? There isn't. We don't have one that says thou shalt not have an abortion. It doesn't exist. And to some degree that creates some problems because if we had it, we could just point to it. Now, I don't think it would change anything because we still have people that break the law all the time, even though we have these don't do this, right? And they just kind of redefine it and reword it, and we find ways to steal and just not call it theft and all these other things, right? So I don't know that it would change the hearts of people, but it would be nice to be able to say the discussion can end. We know whether it's right or wrong. We know whether it's good or bad because we have a defining word or a statute or a law that says it, okay? So there isn't one. That's a problem. So if we don't have one that directly hits the topic, thou shalt not or whatever, what do?
Look for a principle.
We look for a principle? Yep. And how do we do that? If we don't have a verse, so we can say, here it is, Exodus 20, verse 15, thou shalt. How do we look for principles? How do we try to build a body of reason around what we should do in those instances? This applies to more than just abortion, by the way. Think about how thick the book would be if we had to have a thou shalt or thou shalt not for every single thing. The bigger picture is, what does God allow is a question you can ask. Will God allow me to do this? The bigger question, and this is the whole New Testament's idea on using wisdom and discernment in the Holy Spirit, is just because God allows you to do something or doesn't allow you to do something, you have to be willing to say, but what is the heart of God over this? We always stop and say, okay, God says you can't murder or you can't steal. Okay, got it. Checked off. Don't steal, don't murder. But why does God say not to murder or not to steal? Does he just flip a coin and be like, is he stealing? Oh, it's wrong. That's what we're going to call it. How does he determine whether or not that's wrong or right? So the question we need to get to is the principle, and we have to look at what's the heart of God on this principle. Murder. If we didn't have thou shalt not murder, could you go look at other verses and still come away that murder is bad? You could, because you see instances where things happen with people who commit that, atrocity. And so our goal is, when you don't have a verse that says specifically, you do have to go out and build a case using other verses, but you have to keep in mind, if God didn't give me an explicit yes or no, I need to start asking the question, well, what would he do? What is his heart on the topic? What is consistently his response to instances like that? And it kind of gets you stopping and realize you don't have to have a word for every single thing. You don't have to have a thou shalt or thou shalt not for every single thing. Because if you stop and say, what would God do with this? We can kind of come to the conclusion just based on other verses, other things, I used this illustration a while back, when you're little and you think about your grandparents. I'll say, would I do that in front of my grandma? Now that's kind of putting grandma at a higher moral level, But the reason we do that is because that generation, we would say, is closer to a conservative, probably biblical view than the current one. And so I'd say, is my grandma okay if I did that? And it's amazing the number of things that we would be embarrassed and we'd be like, I'm not doing that. Because if my grandma ever found out, And so I do think we kind of have to have that approach to say, let's go higher than grandma. Let's go higher than mom and dad. Let's go to the source and say, what would his heart be? And you can figure out someone's heart by reading a lot of their writing. Did you realize that? If you read the biography, you read his stories, you read what he's saying, you can figure out whether he'd be okay with something without having to have a thou shalt not. So that's kind of what we have to do. We have to kind of build a case using verses to say, what's God's heart on the issue here? Like, what does he really think about this if we don't have a thou shalt or thou shalt not? So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to review the direct and explicit law and commands. Now, I'm calling this statutes, okay? And I'm going to use the word statute, and I'm going to use the term case law. Do you guys know what these are? Statute is something that's just a flat-out law. It's just a thou shalt not, okay? But what's a case law?
It's a case law.
It's just a ruling or a circumstance of events that were ruled on a specific way that may be directly tied to or even just slightly tied to the topic we're in discussion about. But it can guide us. Okay? I worked at State Farm I was in there for 10 years, but I was in 5 years in a unit that investigated rental car fraud. That's all I did all day for 5 years. Okay? And when you're doing that, I would have to investigate rental car companies. All of them. The big ones, all of them. That's what I did. I investigated them because they would say, so-and-so dinged up they returned their car and it was damaged. And then I would call my policyholder and guess what they would say? I didn't do it. And guess what my job was? Figure it out. Did they do it or did they not do it? And a lot of times, anytime that you've done a rental car, if you bring a car back dinged up, you know what they charge you? Loss of use, administrative fees, and they just throw all this extra junk at you. And do you know that the state laws are not real clear on those things? There are some, and guess what? They were my favorite because they had a statute that if you damage someone's car and it's this amount, it's this amount of money, this amount of money. And I could just say, look at the schedule. Done. Super easy. But what about in the states where they didn't have statutes on how to handle this stuff? I spent, I don't know how much time, on the phone with attorneys in Denver. One specific I worked with all the time. And I would say, I need you to write me up a report on what we should do in this circumstance. And he would go pull case law and do a comprehensive investigation of all the cases tied to that topic. And he would send me a report. And I would read through it, and I would have to say, well, okay, it looks like we may have grounds to do this or that. And a lot of times it just had to go to court. But the reason you have to do is you have to try to build a case using the case law that's out there because there isn't a statute. And you're thinking, what would a judge looking at these things conclude if I can try to say these are the consistent ways we've ruled in the past and that's why I think this applies? That's what they do in court. That's how they operate. And so we're going to have to be kind of lawyers. I know, don't throw things at me. We're going to have to do that to some degree today because we don't have a statute to look at. We have to look at case law to figure out what it is. And so that's why it might take us 2 weeks, because I started getting to the cases, and I realized there's a lot more cases on this than maybe I originally thought. And so we might need to broaden that a little bit. So we might have another week on it. So we're going to review the direct laws, if there are any. We're going to review the laws and individual circumstances that appear to be related to the issue. So that's our case law. That's what we're going to look at. And then one thing we want to talk about is reason and motive. Think about any type of case that goes like a criminal case or something. What are they always trying? What could really be your smoking gun? If you can figure out the motive. Why did they do that? In fact, I just heard it this week on the news, and people are laughing at it, but they're saying, we're still trying to get to the motive of the gunman who shot President Trump. What's the motive? I want to kill the guy. Now the question could be, why do you want to do that, right? But motive is always the key.
Who's paid for it?
Yeah. Who's paying for stuff? We want to try to get to the bottom of it. And so one of the things we need to talk about on this topic is the motive. We can talk about allowances versus not allowed, but what about the motive of the individual? Does that play into this at all? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then, I don't think we'll probably get to this today, but we want to look at possible contradictions and difficulties presented in the Scripture. Are there things that seem to shoot the holes in our case, for or against? We need to see. We need to check that out. That might be a whole week by itself. And then hopefully we'll come to a reasonable conclusion based on everything we've been through. Because that's how we should operate. You take a body of evidence, you evaluate it, and then you come to a conclusion. Right? Isn't that how we basically try to do everything? We should. We don't say, well, I feel this. I think this is how I feel. We have to look at the evidence and figure out where it points us. That's what we're going to do with the Bible. That's what we're going to do today. So, some more questions. How does the Bible define or view the unborn? We really probably should know that one, right? How does the Bible define a baby, right? Does it value? What value does it even put on the unborn, if any? You probably should know that. And so you need to remember these things. The Bible does not have a written definition of baby. You can't go to the back like you can. Have you ever read a law brief where they have the law write-up and then they actually will say, when we say, company A, and then they have a definition, or they'll put all these terms. And it's so that there's no question when you read that law, if when you read that word, it's defined. They even do that in your contracts. When they say, when we say someone, that means you and your spouse and your kids. You ever seen that before? Because if they don't do that, people say, we don't have a definition. Well, see, the Bible does not have a back area where you flip in the back and say, what is the definition for baby? It doesn't have that. So we have to try to figure that out. The Bible is not a legal textbook. It has books of law in it, but it's not a legal textbook. Now, what's interesting is Blackstone used to be the source of legal, textbook. I think it might still be, but it used to be. And there's one founder who actually read Blackstone and got saved reading it. Because what did they base it off of? The Bible. So law still has a grounding, but the Bible is technically not a legal textbook. So we have to remember that as we're trying to sift through the pages of where we're at here. And we must use the text to try and get to definition. That's the key. How does it define these things? Remember we talked about Noah Webster? I think was it last week? I quoted his dictionary when we used the term live. We tried to check it out. Interesting thing about Noah Webster, he said this, my original design, he's talking about his dictionary, did not extend it to an investigation of the origin and progress of our language, much less of other languages. But after writing through 2 letters of the alphabet, I determined to change my plan. I found myself embarrassed at every step for want of a knowledge of the origin of words. See, he had realized that what he had been was kind of as getting it passed down to him. And when he started really investigating what a word means, he said, I don't know that I'm actually getting the fundamental meaning of this word. And so that's why definitions are so important. When we say stuff like baby, person, abortion, like these are terms that we have to be able to wrap our heads around. What do they mean? Remember I've told you guys this probably a dozen times. 2 most important questions you can ask ever are, How did you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that? Why? Because then it just sets it straight. We know exactly where we're saying, well, how did you get there? And we want to know what you mean by specific terms you use. Terms are really important. So obviously Webster found that out. He also said this, then laying aside my manuscripts and all books treating of language, except lexicons and dictionaries, I endeavored, by a diligent comparison of words having the same or cognate radical letters in about 20 languages, to attain a more correct knowledge of the primary sense of original words, of the affinities between the English and many other languages, and thus to enable myself to trace words to their source. You realize what he's doing? He's saying, I got to go to case law. I got to go to all these languages and see how they define this term so I can try to build the most universal definition of this. In fact, what does everybody believe this is? How do all the different languages define this term? So he can say, when I build a dictionary, it's going to be a source. I got to make sure I've checked all the sources, put it all together. He says, I spent 10 years in this comparison of radical words and in forming a synopsis of the principal words in 20 languages, arranged in classes under their primary elements or letters. Language is the expression of ideas, and if the people of one country cannot preserve an identity of ideas, they cannot retain an identity of language. You just change the words and the definitions, and what can you do to a society?
Change it.
Bingo. So are definitions extremely important?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Dictionary is extremely important. He's not done. The United States commenced their existence under circumstances wholly novel and unexampled in the history of nations. They commenced with civilization, with learning, with science, with constitutions of free government, and with that best gift of God to man, the Christian religion. Interesting. Our citizens are very little behind the most enlightened people on earth. In some respects, they have no superiors, and our language within 2 centuries will be spoken by more people in this country than any other language on earth except the Chinese in Asia, and even that may not be an exception. He was right. It went actually throughout the whole world, English. This is the guy behind the dictionary. 1825 probably is about the time he wrote this. He was right on, you know. It says, if the language can be improved in regularity so as to be more easily acquired by our own citizens and by foreigners, and thus be rendered a more useful instrument for the propagation of science, arts, civilization, and Christianity, if it can be rescued from the mischievous influence of socialists and the dabbling spirit of innovation which is perpetually disturbing its settled usages and filling it with anomalies. In other words, there's out there people are trying to redefine stuff, and we got to keep it solid. This is in the preface of his 1825 dictionary. This is what he wrote. If, in short, our vernacular language can be redeemed from corruptions and our philology and literature from degradation, it would be a source of great satisfaction to me to be one among the instruments of promoting these valuable objects. If this object cannot be effected and my wishes and hopes are to be frustrated, my labor will be lost and this work must sink into oblivion. So he held it as a pretty important thing, right? To be able to be one who's gathering data to try to define words for the English language. It was super important. To that great and benevolent being, who's he talking about? God. Who during the preparation of this work has sustained a feeble constitution amidst obstacles and toils, disappointments, infirmities, and depression, who has twice borne me and my manuscripts in safety across the Atlantic and given me strength and resolution to bring the work to a close, I would present the tribute of my most grateful acknowledgments. And if the talent which he entrusted to my care has not been put to the most profitable use in his service, I hope it has been kept laid up in a napkin, and that any misapplication of it may be graciously forgiven. In other words, God gave me the gift to write a dictionary, to define things, and I want to use it for the right purposes. This is all right in the beginning of his dictionary. A couple other notable things he said. The Bible must be considered as the great source of all truth, all the truth, by which men are to be guided in government as well as in all social transactions. This is the guy who defines things with the dictionary, telling you you're going to learn it from the Bible.
Yep.
Education is useless without the Bible. You're not going to hear that on campus today. The Bible was America's basic textbook in all fields. God's word contained in the Bible has furnished all necessary rules to direct our conduct. That's all they needed. So defining words can come from the Bible. We can go to the Bible and say, what does it, through principle and through direct statute or law, come to a conclusion? So I say that to say we're kind of going to be the Noah Websters, to say we're going to use this Bible we have to try to define things, because that's what Noah Webster thought was okay. He thought it was fine. He also said the Bible is the chief moral cause of all that is good and the best corrector of all that is evil in human society. Agreed? The best book for regulating the temporal or the secular concerns of men. The education of youth should be watched with the most scrupulous attention. It is much easier to introduce and establish an effectual system than to correct by penal statutes the ill effects of a bad system. The education of youth lays the foundations on which both law and the gospel rest for success. Wow. So in other words, we should teach kids definitions. New England Primer, first textbook. A is for Adam. Adam sinned. That was the kind of stuff they had in there. So Webster's approach, we must look at a body of source data to build a proper definition. He went through 20 plus languages to try to figure out what a word meant. We might have to go through 20 plus scriptures to figure out what baby means in the Bible. As weird as we would say, well, we got that one down. We need to look at it from a scriptural standpoint. Noah Webster used the Bible as a source for building his dictionary. In fact, he used the King James Bible. So how did Noah Webster define abortion? The act of miscarrying or producing young before the natural time or before the fetus is perfectly formed. This is his definition of it. Now, I'm reading this week, and I'm thinking, okay, I got a question. Is miscarry different than today's definition of abortion? It is interesting how even in our minds, we think of these things kind of on different planes, don't we? Why are they different in our minds somewhat today? So one involves human intervention. The other one is natural process
Right.
in a sinful world, right? When we hear abortion, we don't think miscarry. We think those two things are separate. They both end with the same result, the loss of a child or a baby. But the difference between miscarry and abortion in our current day, I would say, has to do with human intervention. Does that sound reasonable? So let's look at some biblical laws. We just got some foundational stuff. Let's just look at some biblical laws real quick, okay? So here's Exodus 21. Now, if you read it in your Bible, it's going to have a heading that says rules regarding murder, manslaughter, and various injuries. Okay? That's Exodus 21. God felt like we better put some statutes out there so that people know these are just absolute no-nos. Okay? Thou shalt not murder type stuff. You would think that would have covered it, but apparently he felt like we needed to have some more details. Here's Exodus 21, verse 12. Whoever strikes someone and he dies will surely be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait and it was an accident, I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man schemes against his neighbor to kill him by treachery, you will take him from my altar to die. You may remember this, the cities of refuge. Do you remember these things called the cities of refuge? So God had these specific cities, and if you were basically guilty of manslaughter, I didn't mean to, my intention wasn't to kill the person, but I did through whatever neglect, being irresponsible, careless. He would say, well, what's probably going to happen? The family's probably coming after you. Someone's coming after you. So I'm going to allow you to go to a place called the City of Refuge that I have created, and you can live there. You're on kind of city arrest. And you can live there, and the only way you get out is when the high priest dies. The high priest died. All the debts were basically wiped clean, and the person could go back and they could get out of the city of refuge. But the idea was, there's two things with this. The contrast here is if you do something intentionally, hence the term treachery. How would you define treachery? With ill intent, to harm, to cause injury, or for some personal gain, not through good means, like the government saying we have to pass a penalty down on someone because they broke the law and we have to do that. That would be a good instance versus, I think I just want your stuff. Not a good instance, okay? And we can get that from don't steal, all the other laws. So if you have treachery involved, what's the punishment? You're going to die. Is if you accidentally did it, God's going to say you're still going to have consequences, but they're just not going to be as severe as someone who did it intentionally with evil intent, evil motive. Do we have these kind of things today? Like laws like this today? Yeah, we do. You can do something stupid and hurt somebody, and the penalty, they might give you a manslaughter charge instead of a murder charge. Why do we have those? Because of this kind of stuff right here. The motive of the individual. The intention was not to do this, it was to do that, and this happened. So motive is a factor. Would you agree? Does this law support the right for someone to live? I would say so, because you have punishment in both instances. Whether it was intentional or unintentional, there's punishment. Because what did you do? What did this person do? They took the life of someone else. You didn't get a pass. You didn't get reintroduced into society as that's okay. You had penalty. You might have had to move, or you might have been killed. But there was some negative that came from taking someone's life. Right? And if men fight and they injure a pregnant woman, hey, we're getting closer. And her children go out. In other words, she goes into premature labor. She has the baby early. And there is not serious injury, he will surely be fined as the woman's husband demands concerning him and the judges determine. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. How does this start? So how does the wrong start based on this verse? What's happening?
Somebody injures.
If men fight, so two guys are in a heated fight, and there's a woman who's pregnant present, and she gets hit. What's the intention of the two men? Let's start with that. What's the motive?
To hurt each other.
To hurt each other. That's right. Are they trying to hurt the woman?
No.
No, they're not. They're fighting. They're being stupid. They're being careless, right? And unfortunately, an innocent bystander gets hurt. And if the baby is born, right now, if there was no baby born early, there's probably not going to be a crime here or a punishment. But in the event that she's hurt in such a way that the baby is born early, but it's not injured, seriously injured, is there any penalty?
Yes. It'll be fine.
It's a fine, even if it's not seriously injured. So in other words, just causing someone to go into premature labor and have a perfectly healthy baby, you're still going to pay a penalty for it. Why?
She did wrong.
Because you shouldn't have been careless. You should have been protecting that woman and her baby, right?
Right.
And God expects that, especially from the men who are supposed to be protecting these ladies. And so he says, you're going to pay a penalty. No one was killed, so no one's going to have to pay the ultimate penalty, but it's still not right. And so you're going to pay a fine. You're going to pay monetarily to the husband for this, because that'll also carry on to the wife, because he was responsible for taking care of his wife. That's interesting. So why just a fine?
Because the baby didn't die.
Because there's no loss of life in this instance. Now you could stop and say, well, the husband was still preparing for this child, and now it's like, surprise, baby's here. Uh-oh, I'm not ready. So you're going to pay a penalty because now he's got to work, or he may have to take time off of work. You don't know the details. Maybe God's saying there's got to be some monetary compensation because you expedited something he was still in the process of preparing for. Unexpected. He wasn't ready for that. Are the men intentionally trying to hurt the woman or her child? No. So in this case, you can make the argument there is penalty for unintentional injury of a pregnant woman and her unborn child. No one's died. We haven't killed anybody. And there's still penalty. So let's just take that for a second from God gave this law. Why is he so set on punishing, even though no one was hurt? I mean, I'm trying to get in God's head here saying, what is it you really want? Why did you give this law?
Protect the innocent.
Don't be careless around innocent life. I think those are all valid arguments from this law, right? There's another one. This is the same thing, the pregnant woman. Now, if in this case she gives birth early and there is serious injury, you will give life in place of life, eye in place of eye, tooth in place of tooth, hand in place of hand, foot in place of foot, burn in place of burn, wound in place of wound, bruise in place of bruise. Okay. Now, we could say this is old-fashioned, we don't do this eye for an eye stuff anymore. Got it. That's not what we're talking about. We're trying to get to what is God's heart, the lawmaker's intent on this law. In other words, if the baby is seriously injured, let's just say worst case scenario, the baby dies, prematurely born, dies because of these two goofballs fooling around. What's the penalty?
Yeah.
Death.
Okay. What does that say about God's thought process on an unborn child?
Life is valuable.
Yeah.
He is willing to say, if you damage it, you will pay with your own life.
Yep.
Now, is he just flipping a coin? Here on this is, I think this is how we'll handle this. Why is he saying this?
Life is valuable.
Because number one, is man have authority to take life?
No.
Ultimately. We can talk about details. Governments are given authority by God for good and punish evil, and that may result in the taking of life, but who authorizes that?
God.
God does. Because you have a responsibility as the authority to keep people online and punish evil and promote good so that it doesn't become crazy, right? In this case, we're just looking at a careless couple people.
Right.
What was their motive? Not to harm the woman or the baby,
Right.
but God didn't really care. I mean, he was lenient, but even if you were careless and your motive was, I didn't mean to, and the baby dies, what does this say? You still die. So in this case, it's even more severe than the one we looked at earlier, where if you carelessly murder somebody, oops, I didn't mean to, manslaughter, God says, get to a city of refuge. He lets them live. But when it's an unborn baby and a woman, and you're careless, he doesn't let you go to a city of refuge. What does he do? You're going to die for it. So you could make the argument that God is more severe on an unborn child's death than a person who's already alive. Can't you?
Yep.
Yeah.
What does that say about God? What does that say about the lawgiver and his weighing of life? All life is important, but innocent life is even more important. It comes with greater responsibility to protect, doesn't it?
Yeah, yes.
That's interesting. So what's the penalty of harming a woman's unborn child unintentionally? Well, if you kill it, you're dead. No indication is made whether the mother wants the child or not. Did you realize that? How does that pertain to today? I have this baby that I'm expecting, and I wanted the baby, and you took it from me because of your carelessness. You're going to pay for it. God doesn't differentiate. He doesn't even say, well, the woman may have become pregnant. I really wasn't expecting this. I didn't want this to happen. He doesn't give an allowance for that. Now, you can read that into however you want. Is it because they never thought about it? They would have never thought a woman would have said, I don't want this baby. I think you could make that argument because babies were a blessing. If you were childless in the Old Testament, it was like you were shunned. How come? What's wrong with you? What did God do? What did you do? So you can make it from a cultural standpoint, or you could just say maybe God said, doesn't matter. I don't care if you want the baby or not. That's not the point. It's if the child is killed, is the child killed against the mother's will? We don't know in this circumstance. We would say it appears that the woman would want the baby, and so this would be a harm against her. You're taking away that from her, and so you're going to pay for it. But he doesn't seem to really differentiate between her right
The babies.
and the baby's, does he? Just said if the baby is born has serious injury, you two who are goofing around are going to pay for it. There's nothing in the text allowing for exception in the case the mother doesn't want the child. Why is that? That was my question. How come God didn't put that in there? Well, if she doesn't want the child, then it's not a big deal, so you don't have to pay the penalty, no life for life, nothing. Doesn't put that in there. God's penalty for the death of the unborn child through accident negligence is more severe in the case of the pregnant mother than any other. That's important to remember. It's not like anything else when it comes to murder. It's the most severe in the murder laws of a pregnant mother. Well, maybe we should ask that last question. What is the difference between the unborn and the already born? How come God put the greater penalty on the one who was not born yet versus the one who was already born? And I don't care if you don't like it. That's just the reality that God did it that way. I don't know why. You think he could have said, well, it's the same rules. If it's manslaughter and a baby dies, you're going to go to a city of refuge. But he didn't.
Well, also, they're helpless.
So that now you're talking about the innocence of the individual coming into play, the reliability on others to take care of them. Is God consider that in the punishment hierarchy?
I think he does.
You could make the case that that's a factor. The law does not place a limitation of enforcement based on a certain number of weeks pregnant. Did you catch that part?
Yeah.
Doesn't say that in that law, does it? It just says if she has the baby early and the baby dies. If this is the law on accidental killing without intention to harm, what would we expect on the intentional killing of the unborn or the preborn? I mean, just common sense logic would say if God doesn't tolerate carelessness that causes it, there's no way he's going to tolerate intentional causing of it. Just consistently across the text, we're not going to find God say, that's okay, but accidents is not okay. It just doesn't happen. What if the mother didn't really want to be pregnant to begin with?
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't seem to matter. We don't have any text that talks about it. Now, I think if we really wanted to spend weeks on this, we could go in and say, what was the Hebrew mindset or the ancient world mindset on a baby and becoming pregnant? What was their thought process?
That was a blessing.
In Hebrew days, back in the time of these guys when the law was there, remember we just talked about it. If you couldn't have children, it was a struggle. Yeah. Yeah, think about the ones, Samuel's mom, If you just give me a baby, I'll give him right back to you,
Yeah.
Because she was so appalled by the other women who had their children. So motive. In the Molech verses, remember the Molech? Going in and sacrificing your children on the altar to Molech. That's what they would do in Israel. And God actually said, that's it. You're done. As soon as they did that, there was just judgment. Exile had to do with that. There was a lot of punishment with that. What was the motive of a parent bringing their child and sacrificing them to Molech?
To appease the gods.
For what reason? Why would I feel like I need to appease the god?
Make their lives better.
Because I need the God to give me blessing on my crops, favor, wealth, more children, fill in the blank. And so what would they do? They believe this idea that if I sacrifice the most valuable thing I have, which kind of is self-defeating if you think about it. If there's no value to a baby or an unborn child, why would that be the thing that God once sacrificed? It was always the most valuable things that you had to sacrifice, your livelihood, things that gave you value. And they would bring him and they would sacrifice him. And the motive was, I'm going to gain something if I give this baby up. They were doing it with foreign gods, and God said that's not acceptable. Although he never asks for child sacrifice. And even when people say, well, what about Isaac? Did he actually kill him?
No.
No, he didn't. So you can't say God's responsible for receiving child sacrifice because he's never actually received it. So in a modern day abortion, what's the motive? I mean, that's kind of the biggest thing. Obviously, your motive is the same thing. You want to kill the baby. But again, what's the motive in that? Why are you wanting to do that?
Selfishness.
Is the motive the difference between a miscarriage and an abortion by our modern day terms?
Yes.
Person says, I want to have an abortion. Person has a miscarriage. It is different because one is the motive is I don't want that thing, I want it gone. The other is I wanted it, and through process out of my control, I lost it. Wow, that's totally different. One involves humanity engaging in the process of taking life. The other one says it's out of my hands. God's the controller of life. See how the difference view is on that? Does the Bible ever support or claim an individual has the right to end a pregnancy out of convenience? Never does. There's no statute on it. There's not even really any case law that would say it's okay. So it's just not there. It's not there. Exodus 23. You will not bow to their gods, and you will not serve them, and you will not act according to their actions, because you will utterly demolish them, and you will utterly break their stone pillars, and you will serve Yahweh your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from among you. There will be no one suffering miscarriage or infertile in the land. I will make full the number of your days. In other words, if you stick with me, what's going to happen?
Blessing, on blessing.
So you can make an argument then, if it's blessings, and he specifically says you won't have a miscarriage, then what can you reverse determine about a miscarriage? It's not a blessing.
Yeah.
It's a tragedy. It's a loss. It's bad. That's different than, I caused something. But they do happen. And it's equally as tragic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But you see, God clearly makes the case here that when you guys go forward, if you follow me, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about the loss of your babies. Of all the things he could have said, you don't have to worry about. He specifically says you'll have children. So I think, again, we're getting to the idea of what's going on in the mind of God when it comes to his value for babies. Seems to be pretty high, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah.
This suggests that miscarriages are not a good thing. They're not a blessing. But what is our society saying about the same process of losing a baby? They just say, well, I didn't want the baby to begin with, and so the baby's lost, and so it is a good thing. God doesn't seem to share that opinion. Not even when it's unintentional. He still says it's not a good thing. Look, children are the heritage of Yahweh. The fruit of the womb is a reward.
Bingo, right there.
Okay, so what's God's perspective on babies?
A
The
blessing.
fruit from the womb. Put whatever you want in there. When David sins, he's talking about himself here. He's not talking about his mom. He's talking about himself here, about his sin with Bathsheba. And he says, against you, he's talking to God, only you I have sinned and have done this evil in your eyes, so that you are correct when you speak, you are blameless when you judge. Behold, in iniquity I was born, meaning I was sinful at my birth. And he says, and in sin my mother conceived me. It's not the act of the conception that's the sin. It's I was sinful at the moment I was conceived. Why does David think that? That means that at the moment of conception, he said, I was full of sin. I had my sin nature the minute that I was conceived.
Yep.
What's his perspective on the unborn? He didn't say, I got it 6 weeks in or halfway through the pregnancy, did he? His sinful nature came when? At conception. That was his mindset. Indeed, you created my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. Me in my mother's womb. That means me in my mother's womb, not just outside of it. Wonderful are your works. He says, I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was created secretly and intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my embryo, and in your book were written days fashioned for me when there were not one of them. So even when he says, I was an embryo, he uses that term. He says, God already had every one of my days determined, like a human being. Things that are applied to humans, he applies it to the embryo, if you want to call it that. You've heard this one? Now in those days Mary set out and traveled with haste into the hill country to a town of Judah and entered into the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. And it happened that when Elizabeth heard the greeting of Mary, the what?
Baby.
In her womb leapt, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Luke is a physician. And what is his argument that happened when these two get together? Elizabeth has an unborn child in her womb. And they call it a baby. And it actually reacts. Elizabeth is 6 months along in this instance. So you could really make the argument and say it was clearly a baby at 6 months.
Yep.
Clearly. Genesis 25, last one. The children in her womb jostled each other, and she said, if it is going to be like this, why be pregnant? She's not having a great pregnancy, is she? And again, this is a question a lot of people ask, probably with different motive. But she's the one going, why am I pregnant? It doesn't say she decided to abort him because she was uncomfortable or was inconvenient. She's just lamenting, right? And she went to inquire of Yahweh, and Yahweh said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples from birth shall be divided, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elders shall serve the younger. And when her days to give birth were completed, then behold, twins were in her womb. Before they were born, how is God talking about them?
2 separate people.
Like they're 2 people. We don't know how far along she was. I'm assuming it was a little further, but I don't know. I guess I have one more. And then if you do not listen to the voice of Yahweh your God by diligently observing all of his commandments and his statutes that I am commanding you today, then all of these curses shall come upon you and they shall overtake you. You shall be cursed in the city. You shall be cursed in the field. Your basket shall be cursed in your kneading trough. The fruit of your womb shall be cursed, and the fruit of your ground, the calves of your cattle, and the lambs of your flock. Once again, the worst possible curse you could get was no kids. Of all the things. It doesn't say you're going to be poor. If it is universally known how one conceives and its ultimate purpose to produce offspring, what would be the motive of someone to alter it?